Welcome to TLDR Neuropsychology, where we discuss various topics related to the practice of clinical neuropsychology. We're continuing our series related to preparation for neuropsychological board certification, focused on the written exam and the knowledge and skills necessary for clinical practice. Today we're going to be discussing some of the foundational neuropsychological theories and paradigms. So this includes domain general theory, domain-specific theory, cerebral laterality, the two streams hypothesis, automatic versus controlled processing, brain and cognitive reserve, executive functioning theory, and the human connectome project. Regarding domain general theory, it's also called the generalist theory, and it has a few fundamental propositions. So first is the idea that most mental acts or functions require the entire brain to complete. There are some exceptions for memory and sensory functioning, which are considered localized. The second proposition is this idea that the fundamental property of the brain is general skills, which include things like general learning as well as reasoning. The third proposition is this idea that long-term memory is distributed across the whole brain, and that brain matter demonstrates what's called equipotentiality, or this idea that brain tissue from different parts of the brain can serve the exact same functions of brain tissue in another area. Additionally, a proposition is this idea that lesion size and intensity, or kind of a combination of the two, are fundamental for what are called organic syndromes, or syndrome secondary to some kind of identifiable brain injury. So brain injury symptoms are considered an expression of the undamaged parts of the brain following the injury. And finally, there's this idea that experience and culture shape the mind as a whole with little contribution from underlying biology. Domain general theory was very popular in the 1920s and 30s as it fit well with the ideas of political progressivism at the time and challenged the popular ideas of biological reductionism. So some of the key figures and developments include Wolfgang Kohler, who studied visual integration and perception, and he stated that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So he proposed this idea that the brain transforms separate parts into a new whole such that the separate parts lose their distinct identity. Behaviorist John Watson and B.F. Skinner indicated that the brain only has a general capacity to learn. Neurologist John Hewlings Jackson argued that mental functions are hierarchical and not localized, building off of each other as we age. And he proposed positive symptoms, which is the disinhibition of lower brain centers, such as the brainstem, when higher cortical controls are removed, and negative symptoms, which is the loss of functioning when superordinate functions are impaired following brain damage. And consistent with this idea of regression in cognitive ability following brain damage, Lev Vygotsky indicated that brain damage causes a regression to earlier developmental stages. Additionally, Dr. Vygotsky proposed that internal representation of social experience drives our mental development, and that inner speech directs all goal-directed behavior and would be a domain general processor, meaning that it can connect with and direct all of our different cognitive processes. Other key figures include Carl Lashley, who found there was a significant effect of lesion size but not localization when it came to rat brain injuries. Particularly, he found that frontal lesions had no greater deficit in conditional learning than non-frontal lesions within the rats he studied. Neurologist Kurt Goldstein popularized the term organismic, which led to the concept of organic brain syndrome, which essentially means secondary to an identifiable injury in the brain. He argued that the fundamental deficit of any brain damage is a loss of abstract attitude or reasoning. And he based a lot of his findings off of patient Schneider, who was a World War I soldier who reportedly sustained small occipital lesions, but presented with a variety of symptoms that were thought by localizationalists to have a different localized origin. There was some later evidence that some of the symptoms were malingered or he was putting on the symptoms to obtain some kind of specific benefit. So the decline of the domain general theory relates to patient Schneider as well, because independent examinations demonstrated that, firstly, he had no visual complaints, which would be expected with occipital lesions. Second, that his functioning improved when he didn't know he was being observed. And third, there weren't any compelling biomarkers to indicate that he had actually sustained an injury in his occipital lobes with the technology they had at that time, which were X-rays and EEG. Furthermore, Norman Geschwind argued that a lot of Goldstein's arguments were consistent with the localizationalist perspective. And furthermore, there was not a lot of evidence to support this idea of regression theory, because number one, children often display great cognitive abilities despite their age, and number two, injuries to people's brain does not make them become more childlike. And in 1950, Carl Lashley changed his position after determining that the methods used for domain general theory would force him to conclude that memory was not contained within the brain at all. And finally, there's extensive data linking specific cognitive functions to discrete brain anatomy. So that moves us on to domain-specific theory. So this is also called cerebral localization theory, and it has a few fundamental propositions. So the idea that the brain has a modular organization, that each module is devoted to one task or function as a specialized processor, and that these specialized processors are reliably associated with different anatomical zones within the brain. So if you look at this graphic to the right, it kind of identifies where some of these specific abilities exist. So vision, visual speech, sensation, some motor control, hearing, motor speech, eye movement, those kinds of things. So aphasia is the prototypical example. And you'll find with a lot of these theories, a lot of them develop based off of specific case examples rather than the gold standard for studies today, which is randomized control trials. So some of the key figures and developments related to domain-specific theory are Francis Gall and his study of phrenology, which was the idea that you could identify someone's personality or behavior based on the bumps on their head. It turns out he was wrong, but he did contribute conceptually in important ways. So the first was this idea that there's mental modularity of faculties and personality. And the second was that the brain can be subject to scientific scrutiny and study. Another key contributor was William James, who indicated that the brain evolved to contain multiple instincts or automatic behaviors. Paul Broca studied a variety of patients with aphasia, and from those studies he indicated that we speak with our left hemisphere. Broca came to this conclusion based on observations following individuals who had had left hemisphere stroke, which resulted in acquired language loss. In particular, he noticed people who had a more frontally oriented left hemisphere stroke had trouble with expressive language, or their ability to produce words while speaking. Additionally, Karl Wernicke helped to identify aphasic subtypes, where he noted that you'll have deficits in auditory comprehension following left posterior lesions, as well as that subcortical lesions to a tract or connected pathway called the arcuate fasciculus disrupts people's ability to repeat information, but not their comprehension. So other key figures include Joseph Dejerin, who identified two causes for alexia, or reading loss, and this included the destruction of the left angular and supramarginal gyri, as well as a disconnection between visual input from an intact memory center. Hugo Liepmann described what he called ideomotor apraxia following left parietal lesions, which disrupted people's abilities to perform skilled hand movements despite having their language abilities intact. And Alexander Luria, who worked with Russian World War I veterans who had sustained brain injuries, kind of systematized the modular geography of the brain into what he called functional units. And he developed a lot of bedside tasks to evaluate these different modules, and a lot of these tasks are still in use today. Hans Tuber developed this concept of double dissociation, where he noted that related mental functions can operate independently of each other. So declarative memory and procedural learning are often thought to be memory and learning systems. However, you can have impairments in declarative memory, which is your ability to remember facts or events, and still have intact procedural learning, which is your ability to learn skills or movements, things like riding a bike. Other landmark evidence included the case of HM, who was a patient who had epilepsy and underwent a pretty significant surgery to remove brain tissue to stop his seizures from occurring. And this included his hippocampi. And following this surgery, he developed anterograde memory difficulties, which meant that he had trouble forming new memories. And this kind of highlighted that connection between particularly the hippocampi and memory functioning. And there's also Sperry and Gazzaniga's split brain studies. So they also studied patients with epilepsy. So they underwent a different procedure. These patients had their left and right hemispheres surgically separated so that they were no longer interconnected. And this allowed Sperry and Gazzaniga to test the left and right hemispheres independently. And what they found that there was a lateralization of the different specific information. So the right brain seemed to process visual information better, and the left brain seemed to process verbal information better. Ralph Reitan, who was a notable neuropsychologist and developed a lot of the early testing batteries, found that single tests for whether or not a brain injury was organic weren't nearly as useful or effective as looking at patterns of performance on various tasks, the signs and symptoms related to the injury, as well as the relationship between some of the test scores that he developed. Another key contributor was Norman Geschwind, who cataloged disconnection syndromes and proved that small lesions below the cortex can often result in marked impairment. Other evidence included research led by Brenda Milner, who found that if you cut out prefrontal tissue, that can cause impairment in executive skills, particularly strategy shifting when problem solving, but was not associated with a decline in general cognitive ability, or G. There's also historical evidence that frontal lobotomies and leucotomies were effective in altering emotional functioning and personality for individuals. There's also evidence that hemispatial neglect, or loss of awareness of part of your sensory field, is more consistently associated with right hemisphere strokes, but not left hemisphere strokes in analogous regions. And finally, findings related to prosopagnosia, which is the inability to recognize faces despite intact ability to detect if there's a face, is caused by lesions to the fusiform gyrus. So there are some limitations to domain-specific theory. First, it lacks a clear explanation for how some of the domain-specific modules integrate for higher order executive abilities, things like reasoning, decision-making, and the initiation of complex behavior patterns. It's also argued that one or more domain general processors is needed to coordinate and resolve conflicts between different modules. So you need some kind of overarching system to process all of the different information that's coming in through and passing through the brain. And finally, some of Luria's ideas haven't been reliably validated in some of the research. So now we're going to move on to another paradigm, which is cerebral laterality. So this is also called cerebral asymmetry or hemispheric specialization. And it's kind of a hybrid between the domain general and domain specific theories. In this view, each brain hemisphere contains domain general processors. So left is a domain general processor for verbal information and skilled movement information, and right is for nonverbal perceptual information. And there's evidence that damage to the left hemisphere can cause aphasia, or difficulty comprehending and or formulating language, and apraxia, which is difficulty with motor planning and or performance of motor movements. Some of the key evidence and developments are Broca's observations related to aphasia, Liepman's identification of apraxia, and in 1961 they had an interhemispheric relations and cerebral dominance conference wherein it was agreed that dominance should be related to specific cognitive functions and not necessarily to the brain matter itself. So the left hemisphere became language dominant as opposed to just being dominant overall. Additionally, Gazzaniga and Sperry's split brain studies significantly contributed to our understanding of brain laterality, particularly regarding right hemisphere's dominance for visual comparison, object and spatial recognition, and the recognizing and processing of faces. They also proposed a conceptualization for right brain, left brain as an interpreter for the right brain and a reporter for the left brain. So other evidence includes dichotic listening tasks. So essentially you wear a set of headphones and they'll play a sound to either your right ear or your left ear or both ears. And there's a strong connection between your right ear and the left side of your brain and your left ear and the right side of your brain. So if you look at the graphic, you can see how those connections run. And what they found was that the right ear had an advantage for verbal stimuli in comparison with the left ear. Remember that the left side of your brain is language dominant, so it preferentially responds to things like verbal stimuli. There's also been a variety of lesion case studies. These have found that focal right but not left parietal lesions typically result in hemispatial neglect. That right lesions often result in euphoria, whereas left lesions often result in dysphoria. And they've also found that there's disruption to prosody following right brain lesions. Prosody being the nonverbal components of speech, including things like rhythm and intonation. There are some limitations regarding cerebral laterality. And what they've found is that language is not necessarily limited to the left hemisphere, particularly for individuals who are left-handed. They find that there's a higher likelihood that language dominance is either mixed or on the right hemisphere. They've also found that right hemisphere frequently contains semantic knowledge, or knowledge of words. There's inconsistent evidence about the conceptualization that the right is global and the left is analytical sequential. So for example, they found that syllables presented to the left hemisphere tend to be encoded globally, whereas syllables presented to the right hemisphere are encoded letter by letter, which is not what you would expect. If the right were global and the left would be more analytical sequential. There's also inconsistent evidence for the right ear advantage. Another paradigm is the two streams hypothesis. This postulates that the brain can be divided into a top-down organization and that there's essentially two streams or pathways through which information travels throughout the brain. So particularly for the perceptual and production systems, you have a dorsal or top stream, and this is for processing and storing spatial features of information. It's also called the where system. And you have a ventral stream, which runs along the bottom of the brain, which extracts object information, so things like color, shape, identity of the object, and is also called the what system. They've also found this distinction in the frontal lobes, where the dorsal frontal lobes are associated with how an action is carried out, and the ventral frontal lobes being associated with the causal relationships between objects and actions. So if you look at this graphic, on the left you'll see the dorsal and frontal pathways running through the frontal lobes, and on the right you'll see the dorsal and ventral pathways running through from the visual system through the other brain areas. So some of the key evidence for this two-stream hypothesis is from various primate studies. So Pohl found there was a difference between egocentric and allocentric perception within the brain of primates. So the processing of information from yourself to an object versus object to object differed. Ungerleider and Mishkin, in their primate studies, found that damage to the inferior temporal lobes led to deficits in object discrimination, whereas parietal lobe damage led to an inability to relearn a spatial location task. Goldman-Rakic et al. Identified a dorsal ventral organization for the frontal lobes in monkeys, with the dorsolateral aspect contributing to spatial working memory and the ventrolateral aspect contributing to object working memory. Other key evidence includes individuals with Balint syndrome, where they have bilateral superior occipital parietal lesions, which these individuals can recognize objects, but they demonstrate difficulty reaching for the objects based on their vision, which is called optic ataxia. Additionally, a 2011 meta-analysis by Borst et al. Demonstrated associations between dorsal activation or damage and spatial relationships and movement detection, and ventral activation or damage and parallel processing performances. So parallel processing is the ability of the brain to simultaneously process incoming stimuli of differing qualities, so things like color, motion, shape, and depth. Another useful paradigm is automatic versus controlled processing. So this paradigm focuses on task demands and difficulty. So for automatic processing, you have behavioral routines that can be executed quickly, effortlessly, and accurately with little forethought. These are considered overlearned behaviors because you've mastered them to the point where you don't really have to consciously think about them. So these include things like simple mental math, repeating back a phone number, carrying on a conversation, identifying written words, exclamation phrases, so things like swearing, or practice motor skills. Controlled, effortful processing are mental operations carried out with effort, planning, and careful attention to relevant circumstances. So these are also called online behaviors because your attention and your focus has to be online to engage in these behaviors. So this would include like a letter search task where you're asked to cross out a T when there's an A before it, but only when there's an A before it, or repeating a phone number backwards, or traveling around in an unfamiliar location, remembering past events or behaviors, or learning new skills. These automatic response patterns are typically induced by common contexts and represent much of human behavior. So most of your life, you're engaging in these automatic responses. And these automatic responses occur in various neurobehavioral domains, which will be talked about in a later lecture, including things like language, motor skills, psychomotor speed, and sometimes problem solving. There's also evidence that we have particular perceptual motor biases that are automatic based on how we have evolved as a species. So that includes things like localizing to sound, so being able to identify where a sound is occurring in your environment. Subcortical areas, particularly the basal ganglia, form a kind of motor habits system. And some of the evidence to support this is that Korsakoff patients demonstrate preserved learning related to visual motor tracking and hand-eye coordination. whereas patients with subcortical dysfunction, like Huntington's disease, demonstrated impaired motor learning. There's significant clinical utility in this paradigm. We found that online tasks are much more sensitive to brain injury. Automatic functions are often preserved following injury and can serve as an indicator for how the person was functioning before the injury occurred. Comparing how people perform automatically or for the controlled processes can help identify the existence of cognitive decline. And errors or slow completion of some of these automatic tasks can indicate whether someone is purposely underperforming during some of the neuropsychological testing. Another useful paradigm are the brain and cognitive reserve hypotheses. So they're overlapping but different concepts. So an increased reserve is considered protective against neurodegeneration and brain injury. The brain reserve hypothesis is also called the cerebral reserve, and it's the brain's ability to tolerate insult or injury and potentially recover following those injuries. And the general idea is that some threshold of neural matter must be lost before it produces functional deficits. So the more brain matter to spare, the less likely you're to see the deficits. So it's kind of like having a reserve of water with a dam. If a drought occurs without a dam and a reservoir of water, it can cause a lot more damage than if a drought occurs when you have that water reservoir. The cognitive reserve hypothesis was developed in response to a discrepancy between objective brain injury and functional impact. They found that there were quite a few individuals who demonstrated severe cerebral abnormalities but didn't show the same functional impact that would be expected given the amount of damage to the brain tissue, particularly within dementia patients. The hypothesis stipulates that having an enriched life experience can increase this cerebral reserve and protect against either brain damage or brain injury. And this modifies the functional and clinical expression of different neurological conditions like Alzheimer's disease or brain injury or neurological diseases. The thought is that this is due to having more efficient synaptic connections or just higher pre-existing cognitive abilities. There's a few factors that are thought to significantly contribute to cognitive reserve, including things like the quality of someone's education, their general lifestyle patterns, as well as just overall learning history. So there's some interesting evidence that supports these hypotheses. So one was a study of nuns in Notre Dame where they were looking at the onset of dementia from this nun cohort. And they noted that dementia signs occurred sooner in the nuns that were less literate than in the nuns that were more literate. Additionally, Biggio et al. Found that there were synaptic differences in individuals with earlier onset dementia versus later onset dementia, where the earlier the onset dementia, the less synapses you had connecting the different parts of your brain. Stern also found that things like higher levels of education, various talents and skills, and more life achievements protected against Alzheimer's disease. So you would have a later onset the more education, talents and skills, and life achievements that you attain throughout your life. Additionally, it was identified that individuals who sustain TBI, and if the TBI is worse, developed Alzheimer's disease much earlier than individuals who had not or had sustained a less severe TBI, indicating that brain injury appears to deplete this cognitive reserve. There are some limitations with this perspective. So there has been mixed research when it comes to things like overall intracranial volume and age-related memory decline. And it's often difficult to separate those enriched life experiences and how the synapses are organized. So the next theory we're going to be discussing is executive functioning theory. This theory was developed to address how specific cognitive abilities are coordinated into complex behaviors. So note that this was a limitation of the domain-specific theory. In general, it's thought that there's one or more general purpose processors that control some of the domain-specific mental operations that we experience. And these general purpose processors guide our attention and our action. So some of the key findings and developments include Alan Baddeley, who argued that there's a single central executive, and that regulates the content of what he called the phonological loop and the visual sketch pad, and working together, all of those constitute working memory, or your ability to hold and manipulate short pieces of information within your head. Akira Miyake proposed that there were 3 general purpose mechanisms related to executive functioning that were identified via factor analysis. And these were the ability to shift your attention between tasks, inhibiting your behaviors, and updating or monitoring your behaviors in real time. Akira concluded that these variables underlie frontal system functioning. Cognitive psychologists Donald Norman and Timothy Challis proposed a supervisory attention system. So this supervisory system identifies situations that are novel or require a lot of that attentional control to produce an appropriate response. So situations like this include when there's hazards around, when you're doing something that you're not really skilled at, when you're making decisions, or when you're kind of working through problems. They indicated that this is achieved through inhibiting many of the automatic responses that we demonstrate. And they also indicated that this model only applies to ordinary learning. If you're interested in learning more about these various topics, as well as preparing for board exams, this is a great book that has a lot of additional information that I haven't covered here, as well as some practice questions to help really ingrain some of that information. We're going to move on and talk about the Human Connectome project. This is analogous to the Human Genome Project, but this focuses exclusively on mapping the brain. So the Human Connectome project, the ultimate goal was to map the structural and functional networks within the brain. And they did this by generating area-to-area connections using a lot of different imaging technologies. So if you look at the graphic on the right, that's a graphic developed by a technology called diffusion tensor imaging, and it just helps identify how the neurons connect with different parts of the brain. And we'll get into the neuroanatomy at a later time and talk about some of the imaging techniques at a later time. They also included, as part of the studies, behavioral testing as well as genetic testing. The initial studies included 1,200 twin and non-twin young adults, but since the initial studies, they've included lifespan studies focused on developmental periods as well as aging periods, and studies about specific disease processes, things like psychosis or schizophrenia, those kinds of things. The Human Connectome project represents a transition from a modular approach popularized by the domain-specific theory to a more network approach for cognition. The overall emphasis is on the interconnectivity and how these networks wire and fire together rather than just focusing on discrete cerebral locations. And they've acquired a wealth of data, and they're still processing that data and will be publishing papers for quite a number of years in the future. You can read more about the Human Connectome project in this paper by Elam et al. That ends our session for today. If you're interested in any additional study resources, you can find them at Brain AACN, where they'll have things like written and oral exam study groups, mentorship opportunities, mock exams, sample questions, flashcards, and other book recommendations. So this has been TLDR Neuropsychology. Thanks for coming out. Be sure to like and subscribe and comment down below, and have yourself a great day.